Okay, so this one's about comparing cultures 10 years apart because over the preceding episodes I've told you stories from mental health care 10 years ago when I had my first episode, and then a year later I became a healthcare assistant on an acute inpatient unit. Then for the 8 years that followed, I was on no medication and I had no relapse. Then I had a relapse when I was writing up my thesis. I used an acute inpatient ward as a patient, and then a few months later, or a year later, I think, I got a job on a PQ. So I'm in a relatively interesting position. I can tell you what it was like as a patient 10 years ago and as a healthcare assistant 10 years ago, and I can tell you what it was like as a patient a few years ago and as a healthcare assistant a few years ago. So this allows me to make a comparison. What happens in 10 years in one NHS mental health organization? What kind of growth does that organization go through? So here's what I've seen. Um, the first time there were quite a few problems, but in both cases there were good people doing their best, and there were people there who probably shouldn't have been, who weren't necessarily looking out for people in the way that they should. The first time when I was a staff member, I was subjected to a particularly challenging style of what you would probably call workplace bullying. And that was a feature of uh, the, the very unique circumstances I was in. I had been a patient on that ward, and then I came back a year later as a staff member. What this meant was that there were people working on that ward who had seen my notes. So it wasn't as clear cut as it will be for most people who have lived experience going into mental health care. That's a problem most people won't have to deal with. But it was a problem I had to deal with. And as I carried out my role there, over the course of doing that and over the course of progressively becoming more and more unpopular, people started to talk to me about the content of my notes. People started to make comments about what was in my notes. And that was particularly challenging. And that's something that didn't happen when I went back, right? So that's a core difference. When I went back as a patient, if I compare my patient experiences, I would say that there are fundamentally the same issues. There are good people working very hard. There are people there who probably shouldn't be, and there are things that are said to patients that can be flashpoints. They can be inflammatory. They can cause issues. And I was very lucky that I'm in a position to, as I've said in previous videos, sort of get in front of my impulses and think quite deeply about what's happening to me. Not everybody with psychosis and schizophrenia has that luxury, or has the privileges that I've had, to see things from different angles. I very much got the sense that the patients, the staff and patients, are still at odds in some way, culturally. There's a culture of us and them still. I saw that as a patient, and I saw that as a staff member. There are also some new cultural issues that were of interest. So on the PQ, for example, I clashed with the culture there. For the first couple of months, I was only there for 3 months. I was on antipsychotics. I was going through major life changes. I wasn't in a position to be working on a PQ. But for the first couple of months, the PQ was very settled. And I would say to the staff in the office, like, this is what you want, isn't it, from a PQ? A settled PQ. It's so calm. Everybody's intensely unwell, but there are no incidents. This is good. This is the ideal. This idea was heavily resisted. I was told, no, we're not here for this. We're here for the drama. Yeah? We're here for the chaos. We're here for the incidents. We're here for the seclusion. We're here for the restraints. That's why we exist. So there was this idea that PQ was sort of special forces. Like, we're Delta Force. We deal with all the difficult stuff. And I was putting forward the idea that, well, my understanding is PQ is about the degree of illness, not about how much violence there is, right? But that idea wasn't something that was shared. And many of the staff, when I started, were almost apologetic. They were almost saying, "It's not normally like this. It will get busier. You know, we will be secluding someone soon," and that was hard to deal with. I also noticed that seclusion was used in a way that I didn't find particularly reasonable or particularly agree with. So, but the food was better. The food was better. They've made an effort with the food, which is good. But generally, the issues are still there. Deeply unsatisfied patients, neglected patients, staff that are not always particularly attentive or receptive, but many staff who are fantastic. I worked with wonderful people on the PQ. What I noticed, actually, one of the biggest differences was that the RMNs were working their asses off. They were working their asses off 10 years ago, but so were the HCAs 10 years ago. And what I found this time around was that the RMNs were desperately overworked. They were drowning in paperwork. And the HCAs, like me, had nothing to do. We were just... I was just sitting on the sofa most of the time, bored. You know, not because I didn't have any risk to deal with, but because the patients were very solitary. They spent a lot of time in their room. And the reason I got that job was I wanted to talk to people. And most of the people on the bed state were very bedroom based. So I would sit in an empty communal area with no one to talk to. I didn't want to be in the office. I had done that 10 years ago and learnt my lesson. You don't stay in the office on a mental health ward for too long. You don't want to be there. It's a toxic place, right? You will see and hear things and get involved in things and get roped into things that you don't want to get tangled up in, right? So I made a decision when I went back the second time. I was like, I am not going anywhere near that office. I'm going to sit out here with the patients where I feel safe. Right. And yeah, I had wonderful conversations with many of the staff there, but some of them, you know, shouldn't have been there. And several of the structures had changed around how they managed restraints. So, and I've talked about this in a previous video, how previously 10 years ago it was much smaller teams. Whereas now, everybody and their mother was called to the ward before a restraint, and it wouldn't be uncommon to see 15 or 20 people pile into an ECA. And I have reservations about that. I think that sends the wrong message. So I don't want to give the impression that you know, I don't want to bash mental health services, because they do a good job with a complex task, but they're also under-resourced in many ways and areas, and there are systemic issues, and many of them haven't been addressed in the last 10 years, and the patient experience isn't too different either. So yeah, on balance, I think some issues have been plugged, some new issues have popped up. The culture has shifted a little bit. The clinical education department are doing fantastic work. They're really working hard to change the culture, but that doesn't filter down to the ward level. And when you hear the conversations that the ward level staff have about the clinical educators, there's very much a sense of like, they don't know what it's like to do our job. They do, actually. They're very experienced. But the staff are finding ways to justify their resistance to some of the newer messaging that's coming down. So it's a very interesting I've had a very interesting set of opportunities to observe the changes in mental health care. And all of those observations taken together have informed the content of these episodes. So, there we go.